February 1945, Guam, Mariana Islands. The air in the briefing room was a physical weight. It was thick, hot, and smelled of sweat, canvas, and engine oil. The humidity was so total that the walls themselves seemed to be weeping. Hundreds of men, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and bombardiers of the 21st Bomber Command were crammed shoulder to shoulder onto rough wooden benches. Their olive drab flight suits were dark with perspiration, clinging to their backs and chests. These were not fresh-faced recruits. They were veterans, and they were exhausted. Their faces were sallow, their eyes etched with the weariness of men who had flown countless hours into the void only to watch their bombs get swept away by an invisible enemy. For months they had been engaged in a campaign of catastrophic failure. They were flying the B-29 Superfortress, the most expensive weapon in human history, a $3 billion gamble that was supposed to be invincible. It was a pressurized marvel of engineering, a super weapon designed to fly at 30,000 feet, safe above the reach of Japanese flak and fighters. But up there in the stratosphere, they had met an enemy no one had planned for, the jet stream. It was a river of wind, a relentless 200-mile-per-hour torrent that grabbed their 100-ton bombers and tossed them like leaves, scattering their formations and blowing their bombs harmlessly into the Pacific Ocean. Their accuracy was less than 5%. They were burning fuel, planes, and men, all for nothing. The war in the Pacific was stalling, and the B-29 was failing. At the front of the room, a man stood before them, a counterpoint to the sweltering heat. He was a large, imposing, scar-faced man of 38 who looked 50. He was chewing on an unlit cigar, rolling it from one side of his mouth to the other. This was Major General Curtis LeMay. He was not a charismatic leader. He was not a beloved pilot's pilot. He was known from his brutal campaign in Europe as a butcher. A man who saw war as a grim equation to be solved. A man who demanded results and had no patience for excuses. The room, already buzzing with the low hum of fans that did nothing but move the hot air around, fell silent. LeMay's voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of emotion. It cut through the humidity like a shard of ice. He did not greet them. He did not offer words of encouragement. He simply began to lay out the new plan, and with every sentence, the air in the room grew colder, the silence heavier, more profound. "The high-altitude campaign is over," LeMay stated. It was not a debate. It was a fact. "Our results have been unacceptable." He paused, letting the cigar complete its journey across his mouth. Then came the orders. "You will strip your aircraft. You will remove the remote control .50 caliber turrets. You will remove the tail guns. You will remove all ammunition, save for the tail gunners." A ripple of disbelief, stunned silence. Men looked at each other, their eyes wide. Stripped the guns? Their stingers were the only thing that kept the zeros off their backs. It was a madness. LeMay continued, his voice never wavering. "You will reduce crew. All gunners, except the tail gunner, are grounded. You will not fly in formation." This new shock was physical. Men shifted on the benches. Alone? Fly alone? Their entire doctrine, their survival, was built on the combat box, a bristling, interlocking fortress of 50 caliber machine guns. To fly alone was to be a lamb presented for slaughter. And then the final terrifying command. "You will not fly at 30,000 feet. You will fly at 5,000 feet. You will fly at night, and you will be carrying a full load of the new M69 incendiary clusters." The room broke. The stunned silence erupted into a wave of angry, terrified, disbelieving murmurs. This was not a plan. This was a death sentence. It was a suicide order. To fly low, slow, because they would be overburdened with a massive new payload of napalm, naked, without their defensive guns over Tokyo, the most heavily defended city on Earth, a city ringed with hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft cannons, searchlights, and night fighters, all waiting for them. They were being sent into a slaughterhouse. LeMay stood impassive, letting the wave of horror wash over him. He knew what they were thinking. He also knew the stakes. He knew that the planned land invasion of Japan, scheduled for later that year, was projected to cost over 1 million American lives. He knew that their current strategy was a joke, a $3 billion embarrassment. The jet stream was unbeatable. The only way to win was to change the equation. He raised his voice just enough to cut through the rising panic. "We are going to do this. We are going to do it until we have burned the heart out of their industrial capacity." He stared them down, one man against hundreds, his will an unbendable rod of iron. He was not asking for their permission. He was not asking for their courage. He was telling them how it was going to be. The briefing ended. The men filed out, not in the loud, boisterous groups of pilots, but in small, grim, silent clusters. They walked back to their Quonset huts under a blazing Pacific sun, the world suddenly feeling unreal. Many of them were convinced they had just heard their own eulogy. They were dead men walking. They looked at their B-29s, those massive, beautiful, silver super weapons, and saw them for the first time as coffins. LeMay's insane gamble was on, and they, the crews, were the ante. To understand the order that was given in that humid briefing room, you must first understand the man who gave it. Curtis LeMay was not born a warrior, and he was certainly not a charismatic leader. He was not a dashing silk-scarf pilot like the aces who graced the covers of magazines. He was, at his core, a cold, brilliant, and utterly ruthless logistician. He was an engineer. Born in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a wandering ironworker, LeMay was forged in practicality. He had to fight for everything. He paid his way through Ohio State University, studying civil engineering by working at a local foundry, coming home at night covered in soot and grime. His mind did not see the world in terms of heroics or glory. It saw the world as a massive, complex mathematical problem, a problem of physics, stress loads, logistics, and breaking points. When he joined the Army Air Corps in the late 1920s, he brought that same icy, analytical mind with him. His crucible was not the Pacific, but the skies over Nazi Germany. As a commander of the B-17 flying fortresses in Europe, he had been handed an equally impossible task: prove the fledgling theory of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. He did not invent the combat box formation, the defensive grouping of bombers designed to create interlocking fields of fire, but he perfected it. He drilled it into his men with a relentless, brutal discipline. He was known for flying the lead plane himself on the deadliest missions, deep into the industrial heart of the Reich. He flew into flak so thick that his crews would later say, "You could get out and walk on it." He piloted his bomber through the infamous Regensburg raid, a mission so bloody and so deep into enemy territory that the sky was black with explosions and swarming with Luftwaffe fighters. He watched with his engineers' detachment as the B-17s around him were sawn in half by 20mm cannons, blossoming into fireballs that carried his men, his friends, into oblivion. He survived, and he learned. He learned that precision was a comforting lie told by generals in Washington. Bombing a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet was a statistical impossibility. He learned that war was not about duels in the sky, it was about attrition. It was about which side could absorb the most horrific punishment and still keep flying. And as he saw thousands of his men die, as he signed the letters home to their mothers and wives, Curtis LeMay forged a new, terrible philosophy. It was a philosophy of cold, mathematical rage. He came to hate waste. He despised failed missions. He believed, with an almost religious conviction, that if you were going to wage war, you had a moral obligation to be as brutal and overwhelming as possible, to end it faster. To him, losing one crew on a mission that failed to hit its target was a profound sin. But losing 1,000 crews on a mission that broke the enemy's back and shortened the war by a single day, that was a victory. He was the systems analyst of destruction. He did not see enemy cities. He saw industrial nodes. He did not see people. He saw man-hours that supported the enemy's war machine. To win, you did not fight their armies. You destroyed their system. You broke their logistics. You broke their will. This was the man who was sent to the Marianas in January 1945. He was not a hero, he was a fixer. He was the man you called when the job was impossible, when the cost was unthinkable, and when all other options had failed. He was the perfect, terrifying instrument for the final, brutal phase of the war. He was not there to lead a charge. He was there to solve an engineering problem, and the problem was Japan. The B-29 Superfortress was not just a plane, it was an article of faith. It was the most technologically advanced, complex and expensive weapons system ever created, costing a staggering $3 billion, more than the entire Manhattan Project that was simultaneously racing to build the atomic bomb. This was America's silver bullet. Each bomber was pressurized, allowing crews to fly in relative comfort at 30,000 feet, an altitude generals believed was an invulnerable sanctuary, high above the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns and most of their fighters. The B-29 was, on paper, the perfect instrument for the American doctrine of high-altitude, daylight, precision bombing. But in the skies above Japan, the theory collapsed. The crews had encountered an invisible, implacable enemy, the jet stream. It was a phenomenon pilots had never faced before. A monstrous frozen river of wind screaming east at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Flying into it, the B-29s, straining at full power, would slow to a crawl over the ground, making them sitting ducks. Flying with it, their ground speed became so immense that bombardiers, staring through their complex northern bomb sights, simply could not calculate a solution. Trying to hit a specific factory from 6 miles up in a 200-mile-per-hour crosswind was, as one pilot put it, like trying to drop a needle into a shot glass from the top of the Empire State Building during a hurricane. The results were a strategic disaster. Mission after mission returned with devastatingly clear reconnaissance photos, bombs scattered for miles, landing harmlessly in rice paddies or splashing into Tokyo Bay. The accuracy was less than 5%. The B-29s were burning colossal amounts of fuel, their crews were risking their lives, and they were achieving nothing. The entire $3 billion gamble was failing, and the clock was ticking down to a land invasion that would cost 1 million American lives. When Curtis LeMay arrived in the Marianas in January 1945, he did not see an unsolvable problem. He saw a flawed equation. He was an engineer, and he attacked the data with cold, detached logic. He saw the reports, the fuel consumption charts, the wind speeds, the bomb plots, and he came to a conclusion so radical, so heretical, it bordered on insanity. The variable wasn't the plane, it was the altitude. The entire American air power doctrine, a decade in the making, was wrong. His solution was a complete 180-degree reversal of everything his crews had ever been taught. His logic was brutal and brilliant. First, he analyzed the enemy. Japan's air defense system, their heavy flak cannons, their searchlight batteries, their fighter interception tactics was entirely optimized for one thing: high-altitude, daylight attacks. They expected the B-29s to come in high. Second, he identified their flaw. At night and at low altitude, their system was disorganized, their radar was less effective at picking up individual, low-flying targets. Their heavy flak guns, calibrated for 30,000 feet, were mechanically incapable of depressing low enough or tracking fast enough to hit a bomber screaming past at 5,000 feet. The Japanese night fighters were few, and their pilots were not trained for low-level, high-speed interception in the dark. Third, he analyzed his own aircraft. What was the B-29's heaviest non-essential component? The guns. The complex computerized, remote-control .50 caliber turrets and their massive stores of ammunition. They weighed tons. At night, LeMay reasoned, flying fast and alone, coordinated fighter attacks were highly unlikely. The gun system, the B-29's Stinger, was just dead weight. This led to his terrifying trade-off. Remove the guns. Remove the heavy ammunition. Remove the gunners who operated them. This single decision would save over 6,000 pounds per aircraft, reduce drag, and dramatically increase fuel efficiency and speed at low altitude. And what would he do with all that saved weight? He would replace it with bombs. But not the high explosive bombs they had been dropping uselessly. He would carry a full payload of the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, a small napalm-filled canister designed to fall, break open, and spray a jet of burning jelly. LeMay had looked at reconnaissance photos of Japan's cities. He knew as an engineer what they were made of: wood, paper, and tar. He knew that Japan's industrial base was a shadow system, with small parts manufacturing decentralized into thousands of homes and tiny workshops, all made of wood. Precision was pointless. The target was the system itself. He put the pieces together. He would send his bombers in at night. He would send them in low. He would send them in naked without their guns, and he would send them in loaded to the brim with napalm. He was not going to try to bomb Japan's factories. He was going to burn Japan's cities to the ground. The suicide order, as it was almost immediately dubbed, ripped through the Quonset huts of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian like a shockwave. The reaction was not just fear. It was a profound, visceral anger. This section expands on that cold, humid briefing room, diving into the psychological breakdown of the men who were being asked to fly into the fire. For these crews, the B-29s defensive guns were more than just weapons. They were a lifeline. They were the stingers, the talismans, the one thing that gave them a fighting chance in the vast empty sky. Each man was part of a team, and the gunners were the guardians of that team. Their entire training, their doctrine, their very survival was built on the concept of the combat box, a flying fortress where each plane's guns covered the blind spots of another. Flying alone was bad enough. Flying without guns was, to them, a betrayal of the highest order. The mockery was immediate, but it was the gallows humor of terrified men. They called it LeMay's suicide run. They called themselves the Naked Wonders. They joked darkly about whether their parachutes would even open, or if they would simply burn up in the firestorms LeMay was so eager to create. Pilots, navigators, and bombardiers, men who had flown dozens of missions over Europe or the Pacific, gathered in hushed, angry circles. They felt they were being sacrificed, their lives thrown away on the insane whim of a desk-bound general. We can follow an archetypal pilot, a 28-year-old skipper named Jack Harrison. Harrison was on his second tour. He had a wife in Texas and a new baby girl he had only seen in faded photographs. He was a good pilot, calm, steady, and protective of his crew. His crew, in turn, worshipped him. When he heard the order, he didn't just get scared, he got cold. He saw the faces of his men, his co-pilot, his navigator, his bombardier, and the gunners he was now being ordered to leave behind. That night, Harrison and a small group of other senior pilots, representing dozens of crews, demanded to see the wing commander, a colonel who reported directly to LeMay. The mood was tense, bordering on mutiny. "Colonel," Harrison began, his voice tight with controlled rage, "what the general is asking is impossible. You're stripping our stingers. You're sending us in naked to be slaughtered." Another pilot chimed in, "Sir, those Zeros, they may not be great at night, but they're not blind. And the flak over Tokyo, it's the thickest in the world. At 5,000 feet, we won't be targets, we'll be pulp." The colonel, a man caught between the iron will of LeMay above him and the terrified crews below, could only repeat the data. The general's analysis shows that low-altitude night defenses are disorganized. The heavy guns can track you. The fighters won't find you. "And what if the analysis is wrong, sir?" Harrison shot back. "Who's flying this mission? The data or us? We are trained to defend our aircraft. You are taking away our ability to fight back. This is a one-way ticket." The confrontation was fruitless. The orders stood. The men were dismissed, their quiet mutiny quashed. Back in Washington, the brass was equally horrified, though for different reasons. LeMay was risking their entire $3 billion investment on a single, unauthorized tactical gamble. He was defying a decade of American air power doctrine. which was built on the moral and strategic high ground of high altitude, precision, daylight bombing. What LeMay was proposing frankly, it sounded like the terror bombing the British Royal Air Force was conducting over Dresden and Hamburg. It was a tactic the Americans had publicly and proudly criticized. If this failed, it wouldn't just be a military disaster, it would be a political one. LeMay was completely, terrifyingly isolated. His crews thought he was a madman. His superiors thought he was a reckless heretic. He knew with the cold certainty of an engineer that if this gamble failed, he would be court-martialed. His career would be over, and he would go down in history as the man responsible for the single greatest aviation slaughter of the war. But his data told him he was right. The wind was the enemy. The altitude was the problem. The guns were a liability. He absorbed the criticism. He took the borderline insubordination. He chewed on his unlit cigar, and his orders did not change. To his subordinate commanders, he made a critical promise, one that silenced the remaining debate. If this mission fails, LeMay said, his voice flat, if the losses are as bad as they think they will be, I will personally fly the lead plane on the next mission, and the next, until it works, or until I don't come back. There was no arguing with a man like that. The mockery stopped, replaced by a grim, fatalistic silence. The crews began to strip the guns. The night of March 9th, 1945, was clear and cold. On the airfields of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, an apocalyptic procession began. 334 B-29 Superfortresses, engines howling, lumbered down the runways. They were dangerously overloaded, heavy not with bullets, but with fire. Each plane was packed with 6 to 8 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, their bomb bays filled to capacity. The planes, stripped of their gun turrets, looked strange, naked, their familiar bristling silhouettes replaced by smooth, fared-over metal sheets. The mood in the cockpits was not bravery, it was a cold, quiet fatalism. Pilots fought the controls, the heavy bombers struggling to get airborne, their wings weighed down with napalm. Several planes crashed on takeoff, turning into instant, raging fireballs that lit up the pre-dawn darkness, a terrible omen for the men still waiting to fly. But the stream did not stop. For hours the silver giants launched one after another, climbing not to the safety of the stratosphere, but leveling off low at just 5,000 feet. They did not form up. There was no combat box, no protective formation. They flew alone in utter radio silence, each bomber an isolated island of fear in the vast dark sky. They were navigating as individuals, racing toward the same coordinate. For the crews, it was the longest flight of their lives. They flew low over the black, churning ocean, the engines a monotonous drone. Every creak of the airframe, every flicker on a gauge was a potential disaster. They were alone. No gunners chattering on the intercom, no friendly wings to tuck into, just the dark water below and the stars above. Then, from 50 miles out, they saw it, a faint, sickening orange-red glow on the horizon. It was not the lights of a city, it was the city itself, already beginning to burn. The first wave of Pathfinder planes, flown by the most experienced crews, had just arrived. They dove into the darkness and dropped their bombs, not at random, but in a precise, massive X pattern, marking the center of the Shitamachi district, the most densely populated wood and paper neighborhood in Tokyo. They had delivered the kindling. Now the main force arrived. For the next 2 hours, a relentless, terrifying stream of naked B-29s flew directly into that burning X. The sky over Tokyo became a river of silver bombers. From the cockpit, it was a vision from Dante's Inferno. The Japanese, just as LeMay had predicted, were caught in total confusion. Their heavy anti-aircraft guns, calibrated for targets 6 miles high, fired wildly, their shells exploding uselessly thousands of feet above the American bombers. The searchlights, hundreds of them, swept the sky in a panicked frenzy, unable to lock onto the fast-moving low-altitude targets. A few Japanese night fighters, scrambling to intercept, were equally bewildered. They were looking for high-altitude formations, not a low-level stream of individual bombers. The B-29s were simply too low, too fast, and too numerous. But the real enemy the crews discovered was not the Japanese. It was the fire itself. The city exploded. The M69s rained down, hitting roofs, crashing through paper walls, and spraying high-velocity jets of burning napalm. The tinder-dry city, fanned by a strong wind, did not just catch fire, it detonated. A firestorm was born, a self-sustaining vortex of flame that began to suck the oxygen from the air. The updrafts from this man-made volcano were so violent that they grabbed the 100-ton bombers and tossed them like leaves. Pilots gripped their yokes, fighting to control planes that were suddenly flipped onto their backs, dropped thousands of feet in an instant, or slammed upwards by invisible fists of superheated air. Inside the bombers, the temperature gauges spiked. The smell, even at 5,000 feet, was overwhelming. The air filled with the sickening, acrid stench of burning wood, tar, paint, and something else. Something they would never forget. It was the smell of a million lives being vaporized. Smoke, thick and oily black, poured into the cockpits, forcing the pilots to fly on instruments, choking their eyes watering. The fire below was so bright it looked like daylight, a roiling, liquid sea of white-hot flame that had erased 16 square miles of a city. As dawn broke over Tokyo, the smoke was so thick, so vast, that it blotted out the sun, casting a bruised, premature twilight over the ruins. What had been a living, breathing metropolis of 7 million people was now a flat, smoldering plain of ash. The firestorm, fueled by tens of thousands of wooden homes and fanned by a fierce wind, had incinerated 16 square miles of the city. It was an area so large that it defied comprehension. Rivers had literally boiled, evaporating in their beds. Steel bridge girders had melted and twisted like wax. The heat at street level had been so intense that it created its own weather system, a vortex of flame that left nothing but charred rubble and blackened canals. In the heart of the inferno, over 100,000 people were dead, more than the initial atomic bombings of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 1 million more were left homeless, wandering in a daze through a landscape that had simply ceased to exist. Hours later, on the airfields of the Marianas, the B-29s began to straggle back. They did not return as a triumphant armada. They limped in, one by one, their gleaming silver skin blackened with soot and oil. The ground crews watched in stunned silence as the planes landed, the pilots staring blankly from their cockpits, their faces pale, streaked with sweat and grime. Men stumbled from the hatches, many immediately falling to their knees on the tarmac, vomiting, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. They were not cheering. They were traumatized, hollowed out by the sheer apocalyptic horror of what they had just unleashed. But Curtis LeMay was not watching the men. He was in the command center, chain-smoking, his eyes fixed on the teleboard. He had made his gamble, and now the price was being counted. His entire career, the validation of his insane tactic, rested not on the destruction of Tokyo. He had expected that, but on the cost to his own force. How many planes had he lost? How many of his crews, flying naked into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, had paid for his theory with their lives? The reports trickled in, a plane down here, mechanical failure. Another there, caught by a lucky flag burst. The numbers climbed, 5, 8, 10. Finally, the last overdue plane was accounted for. LeMay looked at the final tally. Out of 334 bombers that had flown the mission, only 14 were lost, a loss rate of just 4.2%. The room was silent. This number was unbelievable. It was staggeringly low. The high-altitude daylight missions, the safe missions that everyone had believed in, had been suffering loss rates just as high and sometimes higher, all while hitting nothing. LeMay's suicide run had been, statistically, one of the safest and most profoundly effective raids of the entire war. He had proven his engineering hypothesis with terrifying absolute certainty. The Japanese defenses had been completely overwhelmed. Flying low and at night had rendered their entire air defense doctrine, their heavy guns, their fighters, utterly useless. The guns he had ordered stripped from the B-29s hadn't even been missed. The men who had called him a madman, the crews who had believed they were flying to their deaths, now looked at their imposing cold-eyed general with a new, terrifying mixture of awe and fear. He had been right. The gamble had worked. The equation was solved. The mockery and doubt phase did not just end, it was vaporized in the firestorm over Tokyo. When the traumatized crews returned to the Marianas, the gallows humor about LeMay's suicide run was gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow-eyed silence. The men were horrified by the destruction they had caused, but they were also undeniably alive. The tactic that was supposed to slaughter them had in fact been their salvation. The debate was over. The suicide mission was now suddenly the only mission. Back in Washington, the Pentagon was thrown into a state of profound shock. The generals who had decried LeMay's tactic as heretical and reckless were now staring at reconnaissance photos that defied belief. 16 square miles of an enemy capital, erased from the map in a single night, with minimal losses. The data was absolute. The madman who had defied all doctrine was, overnight, hailed as the ruthless, pragmatic genius they desperately needed. All resistance to his strategy vanished. LeMay, the isolated gambler, was given carte blanche, a blank check to continue his campaign, and LeMay wasted no time. This was not a one-off psychological blow, this was the new doctrine, the new gospel. He unleashed his naked B-29s with the relentless, systematic precision of an engineer. What happened to Tokyo was not an anomaly, it was the blueprint. Just days later, his bombers, stripped of their guns and loaded with incendiaries, hit Nagoya, then Osaka, then Kobe. One by one, Japan's great industrial cities, which LeMay had correctly identified as tinderboxes of wood and paper, were systematically incinerated from low altitude. The effect on Japan's war machine was catastrophic and immediate. Their industry, deliberately decentralized into thousands of shadow factories, small family-run workshops hidden within civilian neighborhoods, was now their single greatest vulnerability. LeMay's firebombing campaign did not just target factories, it erased the entire industrial ecosystem. The ability of the Japanese Empire to produce bullets, to machine engine parts, to wage war, was not just crippled, it was burned to the ground. The back of their industrial capacity was broken before the atomic bombs were ever dropped. The unauthorized, insane tactic, born from one man's cold calculations in a humid Guam hut, had become the new, terrifying and unassailable doctrine of American air warfare. The laughter had stopped. The blitz had begun. Curtis LeMay never sought forgiveness, and he never offered an apology. After the war ended, a conclusion he had ruthlessly accelerated, first with fire, then by overseeing the atomic strikes, he did not fade into quiet retirement. He was not haunted, at least not publicly. He was promoted. His terrifying gamble, the suicide run that had horrified his superiors and his own crews, became the foundational text for the new atomic age. LeMay, the cold engineer, was recognized as the architect of modern strategic warfare. He was given command of the newly formed Strategic Air Command, or SAC. For the next decade, he would build SAC into the single most powerful and destructive military force in human history. The logic he applied was the same. He saw the Cold War not as a political struggle, but as another, larger engineering problem. The naked B-29, flying low and alone over Tokyo, was the direct ancestor of the nuclear-armed B-52s he would soon have flying 24/7, ready to unleash an apocalypse on the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. He had taken his brutal hypothesis that overwhelming system-wide destruction is the only true deterrent, and turned it into the global doctrine of mutually assured destruction. His crews, the men who had once called him a butcher, would go on to fly for him at SAC, this time with an almost religious devotion. He was no longer a madman. He was the high priest of the bomb, the one man who understood the cold calculus of the new world he had helped create. LeMay himself remained blunt, controversial, and utterly pragmatic until his death. He famously and coldly remarked, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." He never flinched from this truth. He knew with the clarity of an engineer that he had crossed a moral line, but he also knew with that same cold logic that in his mind it had worked. This story is not like the quiet tales of farm boys stitching ammo belts or mechanics jury-rigging an engine. It is not the simple story of a humble hero overcoming the odds. It is a story about the terrifying nature of innovation in total war. It forces us to confront the dark, razor-thin line that separates madness from genius. Curtis LeMay was not mad. In fact, he was perhaps the most logical, rational man in the entire Pacific Theater. He was a true systems analyst. He saw a complex problem. High-altitude bombing was failing, and a land invasion would cost 1 million lives. He identified the variables, the jet stream, the enemy's defenses, the weight of his planes, and he devised a solution stripped of all emotion, all tradition, and all human sentiment. The laughter he faced was the laughter of men who still believed in the old rules, in the romance of a clean fight, in the valor of a gunner's duel. LeMay's genius was in realizing that those rules were obsolete. He wasn't just fighting the Japanese, he was fighting the jet stream. He wasn't just bombing a city, he was dismantling a system. His legacy, therefore, is not a statue. It is the complex, morally grey world we inherited. It is the understanding that sometimes the idea that sounds the most insane, the most suicidal, is the one based on the purest, coldest data. It's a terrifying lesson that in the face of an impossible problem, the person willing to break every rule, tactical, moral, and doctrinal, is the one who holds the power to change the world.